The rusted skeleton sat half buried in prairie grass, its green paint flaked away by decades of Montana winters. Tom Brennan had walked past the old John Deere every day for 3 years, without a second glance, just another piece of junk left behind by the ranch's previous owner. But on that frost-bright November morning, when his newer tractor's transmission finally gave out and the repair estimate came back at $18,000 he didn't have, Tom found himself staring at that abandoned machine with different eyes. He had 2 weeks to get his winter hay baled before the snow came, 500 head of cattle depending on him, and a bank account that had been bleeding dry since beef prices crashed. The rusted tractor might be his only option. What he discovered when he finally pried open its engine hood would not only save that season's harvest, it would unravel a mystery that had haunted his land for 40 years and lead him to a fortune he never imagined. If you're settling in for this story, grab yourself a coffee and get comfortable. This is one of those tales that reminds us why we never give up, even when everything seems lost. And if you enjoy stories about perseverance, hidden treasures, and the stubborn hope that keeps family farms alive, please hit that subscribe button. Now, let's get into how an abandoned piece of machinery became the answer to prayers Tom didn't even know how to pray anymore. Tom Brennan's boots crunched through the frozen mud as he made his way across the north pasture, his breath forming white clouds in the November air. The call from Miller's repair had come an hour ago, and Pete Miller's voice had carried that particular tone of sympathy that working men reserve for delivering bad news to other working men. $18,000 to rebuild the transmission on the 2015 John Deere 145R, and that was if they could even find the parts. Tom had thanked him, hung up, and stood in his kitchen staring at the calendar on the wall where his wife Sarah had circled the dates in red. 2 weeks until the first major snow was forecast to hit their corner of Montana. 2 weeks to get 40 acres of premium alfalfa hay baled and stored, or watch it rot under winter's blanket while his cattle starved, come February. The Brennan Ranch had been in his family for 4 generations, passed down from his great-grandfather, who'd claimed this land in 1924. Tom had grown up hearing stories about the hard years, the Dust Bowl, the droughts, the times when cattle prices plummeted and banks came calling. But those were stories, sepia-toned memories that seemed romantic in their distant hardship. This was different. This was his watch, his failure, happening in real time and in full color. Beef prices had crashed 18 months ago and never recovered. The drought last summer had forced him to buy feed at premium prices. His equipment was aging out all at once, like it had formed a pact to bankrupt him simultaneously. And now the transmission, the killing blow delivered with mechanical precision. He'd walked this same path 1,000 times, past the old homestead foundation, past the lightning-struck cottonwood, past the abandoned tractor that had been sitting in the same spot since before he and Sarah bought the place from the estate sale. Old Edgar Hartley had owned this ranch for 42 years before dying alone in the house at age 87. The estate liquidation had sold off most of the equipment, but nobody wanted that ancient John Deere. Too old, too rusted, too far gone. The auctioneers had literally laughed when Tom asked if it was part of the lot. "You want that pile of rust? It's all yours," they'd said. So it had sat there, slowly being reclaimed by the prairie, a monument to obsolescence. But this morning, with desperation sharpening his vision, Tom stopped walking. He stood 20 feet from the abandoned tractor and really looked at it for the first time. The green paint was mostly gone, exposing rust-patterned metal underneath. The tires were flat and cracked. The seat was a skeleton of springs and rotted padding, and bindweed had grown up through the engine compartment. But beneath the decay, he could see the bones of the machine, the solid cast-iron engine block, the heavy steel frame, the stubborn geometry of agricultural engineering from an era when things were built to last forever. It was a 1963 John Deere 4010. He knew that much from the faded decals. His grandfather had run one, just like it back in the 70s. Always said it was the most reliable machine he'd ever owned. Tom had no money for repairs, no money for rentals, and no options left. He had 2 hands, a shed full of tools, and 2 weeks until snow. He started walking toward the tractor. The engine hood fought him, frozen shut by rust and time, but Tom levered it open with a crowbar and peered inside. What he found was both worse and better than he'd expected. The engine was seized. That was clear from trying to turn the flywheel, but it was also remarkably complete. No one had stripped it for parts. The fuel system was gummed solid with ancient diesel turned to varnish. The battery was long dead, its casing cracked and leaking decades-old acid. But as Tom brushed away layers of dirt and dead leaves, he saw that the fundamental machinery was intact. The cylinder head showed no cracks. The fuel injection pump was still mounted. This wasn't just a rusted hulk. This was a patient in a coma, waiting for someone to care enough to wake it up. He spent that entire day doing triage, making lists in a notebook with numbed fingers as the temperature dropped. The tires would need replacing. No way around that. The hydraulic system would need new seals and fluid. The electrical system would need complete rewiring. But the engine, the heart of the machine, might be salvageable with penetrating oil, new filters, fresh fluids, and patience he wasn't sure he had. That evening at dinner, Sarah watched him sketch diagrams and make calculations. She didn't ask if it was possible, because she knew that wasn't the right question anymore. The only question was whether he could make it happen in time. "The hay won't wait," was all she said, and Tom nodded, understanding that she was giving him permission to attempt the impossible. The next morning began a routine that would consume the following 13 days. Tom would wake at 4, work on the tractor by floodlight until dawn, then handle the essential ranch chores before returning to the tractor until midnight. He pulled the engine pan and found the oil had turned to sludge, thick as peanut butter and black as sin. He removed each fuel injector one by one, soaking them in solvent, cleaning them with brushes meant for painting miniatures, his reading glasses perched on his nose as he worked with jeweler's precision. He drained the fuel tank and found it coated inside with a shellac of oxidized diesel that he scraped out handful by handful. The radiator was corroded through, so he drove to 3 salvage yards before finding one from a 1965 model that would work with modifications. Each small victory cost hours of labor and revealed 2 new problems. On the 5th day, while cleaning out the cab to access the wiring harness, Tom's hand brushed against something that didn't belong. The seat frame had a hollow space in the springs, and wedged deep inside was a metal box about the size of a lunchbox, wrapped in oilcloth. He pulled it free, his heart suddenly pounding for reasons he couldn't name. The cloth crumbled as he unwrapped it, and inside the box he found a leather journal, a manila envelope stuffed with documents, and a folded piece of paper that looked like it had been drawn by hand. The journal's first page was dated March 15th, 1981, and written in careful block letters were the words, "If you're reading this, I'm either dead or too old to care anymore. What I'm about to tell you, I never told another living soul." Tom sat in the dirt beside the tractor as the sun climbed higher and began to read Edgar Hartley's secret history. Edgar Hartley had been a geologist before he was a rancher, Tom learned from the journal's early pages. He'd worked for mining companies throughout the 1950s and 60s, surveying land across Montana and Wyoming before settling down to buy the ranch in 1963. The same year he'd purchased this very tractor, brand new, from the dealer in Billings. Edgar wrote about his decision to leave the mining business, about wanting a simpler life, about meeting his wife Martha, and promising her stability instead of the constant travel his geology work demanded. But he never stopped being a geologist. He never stopped reading the land, seeing the story written in stone and soil, that invisible to everyone else. In the summer of 1979, while plowing the northern section of his property, Edgar had noticed something peculiar in the exposed soil. There were mineral traces, subtle colorations, and rock formations that his trained eye recognized immediately. He'd taken samples, run tests in secret, and confirmed what he'd suspected. There was a significant rare earth mineral deposit running through a section of the ranch, the kind that mining companies would pay millions to access. But Edgar had made a choice that Tom, reading by flashlight in his cold workshop, struggled to understand. Edgar had decided not to tell anyone. Not Martha, not the mining companies, not even the bank when he'd struggled with his own debts in the early 80s. He'd buried the knowledge like a time capsule, hidden the survey maps and mineral assay reports in his tractor, and gone on ranching. The journal explained his reasoning in passages that Tom read twice to fully grasp. Edgar had seen what mining operations did to land, had watched companies come in with promises of wealth and leave behind poisoned soil and destroyed water tables. He'd bought the ranch to preserve something, to keep this piece of earth intact and productive. Martha had wanted children, though they'd never been blessed with them, and Edgar wrote about his vision of passing the ranch down to grandchildren who didn't exist, of keeping the land healthy for generations he'd never meet. The money would be nice, he wrote in an entry from 1983, but money doesn't love the land. Money doesn't wake up early to check on calving cows or spend evenings mending fence. This deposit has been here for millions of years. It can wait for someone who needs it more than I do, someone who will make the right choice about whether to dig it up or leave it sleeping. The manila envelope contained the proof. Geological survey maps marked with Edgar's notations. Mineral assay reports from a lab in Denver showing significant concentrations of rare earth elements, and most importantly, a legal document. Edgar had separated the mineral rights from the surface rights back in 1981, creating a legal entity that held those mineral rights in trust. The trust documents were complex, but as Tom read through them with growing astonishment, the structure became clear. Whoever owned the surface land, the ranch itself, would automatically control the trust and mineral rights after Edgar's death. Edgar had essentially hidden a fortune in legal paperwork, tucked it away with the geological evidence, and left it all in the tractor. The hand-drawn map showed exactly where the deposit was located. A 40-acre section in the northwest corner of the property, currently home to Tom's premium alfalfa hayfield. The very field he was racing against time to harvest. Tom didn't sleep that night. He sat at his kitchen table with the documents spread before him, Sarah reading over his shoulder, both of them afraid to speak and make it less real. The assay reports were dated, but the geology wasn't going anywhere. A quick internet search revealed that rare earth element prices had increased dramatically since 1981, driven by demand for electronics, renewable energy technology, and defense applications. What Edgar had valued in the low millions might now be worth 20 times that amount. Maybe more. But the hayfield needed harvesting in 8 days. The tractor was still in pieces. And Tom realized with a clarity that felt like ice water in his veins that Edgar's last test was whether he would become obsessed with the treasure or finish the work that needed doing. He chose the work. The next morning, Tom was back under the tractor, installing the rebuilt fuel injection pump with hands that trembled slightly from exhaustion and revelation. He didn't tell anyone about the discovery, not even his brother, who called to ask if Tom needed to borrow money. The secret sat in his chest like a coal, warm and dangerous, while he threaded new wiring through corroded channels and bled air from the hydraulic lines. Sarah brought him meals he ate without tasting, and in the evenings he would pull out the hand-drawn map and study it, memorizing the landmarks Edgar had noted. An old fence post marked with red paint, a lightning-struck pine stump, the bend in the creek where it turned south. All of it was still there, 40 years later, waiting. On the 11th day, with 3 days remaining before the snow, Tom finished the last major repair. He'd replaced the starter motor with one from a salvage yard, installed a new battery, filled the radiator with fresh coolant, and pumped diesel into the cleaned fuel tank. The moment felt ceremonial. He'd invested 80 hours of labor, maxed out a credit card for parts, and survived on 4 hours of sleep per night. The tractor looked almost good. The rust cleaned away from critical areas. New tires mounted. Fresh paint on the hood, where he'd had to repair corrosion damage. It wasn't showroom new, but it was honest. It was ready. Tom climbed into the seat, said a prayer to gods of agriculture and mechanical resurrection, and turned the key. The engine turned over once, twice, 3 times, coughing and stuttering. Black smoke belched from the exhaust stack. Something rattled that shouldn't rattle. Tom adjusted the throttle, gave it more fuel, whispered encouragement to metal and machinery. And then, with a roar that sent crows exploding from nearby trees, the engine caught and held. It ran rough for 30 seconds, smoothing out as oil circulated and cylinders heated to proper temperature. Tom sat there with tears on his face, listening to the most beautiful sound he'd heard in years. An engine that shouldn't run, running anyway. He let it idle for 20 minutes, checking for leaks, monitoring the temperature, making final adjustments. Then he put it in gear and drove it, slowly and carefully, across 300 yards of prairie to the hayfield. The old John Deere had come home from its long exile, and there was work to do. Tom baled hay for 3 straight days, racing against a sky that grew heavier and grayer with each passing hour. The old John Deere ran like it remembered what it was built for, pulling the baler through windrows of alfalfa, the mechanical rhythm as steady as a heartbeat. The tractor was slower than his newer model had been, less efficient, harder on his back from the ancient seat springs, but it ran. It did the work. By the time the first snowflakes began falling on the evening of the 3rd day, Tom was stacking the last bales in the barn, his hands blistered and his muscles screaming. But 500 tons of premium hay, safe and dry. He'd made it. That night, with snow accumulating outside and Sarah asleep upstairs, Tom sat with Edgar's documents one more time. He had decisions to make. The mineral rights could change everything. Pay off the ranch, modernize equipment, secure their future, and maybe fund the next generation if his daughter decided she wanted to take over someday. But it would mean bringing in mining companies, turning 40 acres of productive soil into an industrial site, breaking the land in ways that might never heal. Or he could do what Edgar had done, leave it buried, pass the secret along to whoever came next. The choice wasn't about money anymore. It was about understanding what Edgar had tried to preserve and whether that preservation still mattered in a world that measured everything in extraction and profit. In the end, Tom made a 3rd choice, one he thought Edgar might appreciate. He contacted a university, anonymously at first, and then openly after learning about their research into sustainable rare earth element extraction methods. The technology was still experimental, but scientists were developing ways to harvest these minerals without destroying the land, using biological processes and selective separation techniques that left the soil intact. Tom proposed a partnership. They could use his 40 acres as a research site, develop and prove the technology, and if it worked, they'd split the eventual profits. It would take years, maybe decades, but the land would survive. The hayfield would keep producing, and when the technology was ready, the wealth Edgar had hidden would fund something better than just one family's prosperity. It would fund the knowledge of how to take from the earth without destroying it. The old John Deere sat in Tom's equipment barn now, restored and maintained, still used for light work around the ranch. Tom had mounted a small brass plate on the dashboard, engraved with words from Edgar's journal. The land remembers everything we do to it. Every time he climbed into that seat, he thought about the chain of decisions that had led from Edgar's choice in 1979 to his own choice 4 decades later. The abandoned tractor had saved his harvest, revealed a hidden fortune, and taught him that sometimes The most valuable thing you can do with wealth is wait for wisdom to catch up with it. The snow had come and gone. Spring would return, and the hayfield would grow again over ground that held both treasure and the patience to leave it sleeping a while longer. Some things, Tom had learned, are worth more when you're willing to let them wait.